Okay, I think I'm good. Okay, hopefully today we can finish up with the sanctuary. So I'll cross that off. Yeah, I think I'm on.
Chad,
Yes.
under where is that at? Let's see. Just over here with the.
What's that?
What's that C go under? Sacrifices?
This here?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. What letter or number did I put sacrifices for communion under? Repairing the covenant? Okay, this should be repairing the covenant. What number letter is that or number? Okay. So this is under repairing the covenant. Okay. Sometimes I disconnect from what I said the previous day, but to remind you, when we come to sacrifice is a very foreign concept to most of us. Because God creates the world, most of everything that He has to do is in and through the created order that He makes. However, after man falls away, then the idea of sacrifice presents itself. Now we find this in the story of Cain and Abel. Prior to Cain and Abel, there was no sacrifice. Adam and Eve didn't bring sacrifices. So the historic point at which God's covenant becomes an issue is when the created order is entered into corruption, and now He redeems it by putting to death and bringing life out of death. And so there are three functions of sacrifice. The first I dealt with very briefly, which is to establish covenant. And there are various instances in which that occurs. The Noahic covenant is the first, where He performs a sacrifice, and all of creation is now in covenant with the Lord. The commands for all of creation aren't particularly high. They're not to murder each other. And in exchange for that, they are to know that the human race and the whole of earth will continue. That is God's promise in the Noahic covenant, that all of this will continue. The second covenant sacrifice is under Moses. And we see that occur at Mount Sinai, where he reads to the people the book of the law and he sprinkles on them the blood. And at that point, they enter into the covenant. There is also a third covenant with the priesthood, which we read about in the book of Leviticus. The priests are in a special covenant with the Lord because they are in His presence all the time. They eat from sacrificial food. And so that is another. And so within these covenants, you can maintain or repair the relationship with the Lord. So today we're going to look at repairing. Yesterday we looked at maintaining covenant, and we learned that a good deal of the sacrifices that are performed are not for sin at all. They are just to provide food, and they are for celebration. So we looked at that yesterday, and today we're looking at repair. There's a passage in the book of Hebrews. We've all read Hebrews by now, right? A very, very important passage at the end of the book of Hebrews that says, we have an altar from which the priests who serve at the temple have no right to eat. How many of you remember reading that verse? Yes. Not many, okay. It's right here in the back of the book of Hebrews, very, very important. Let's see, we got to get past Paul. I think it's in chapter 13. Yeah, I'm always right, so here we are. No, not always. My wife could tell you some stories. Chapter 13, verse 9. I'll just read it. Do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings. It is good for our hearts to be strengthened by grace, not by ceremonial foods, which are of no value to those who eat them. The writer of Hebrews is indicating that the new Christian community is not as concerned about eating ceremonial food from the temple in the old way that they used to be, but they're interested in receiving grace through Christ. Now, there's a couple important things to. One of the things this passage indicates is that this book is very old. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D. Jesus was crucified about 30 A.D. So the book of Hebrews seems to assume that the temple hasn't been destroyed yet. Does everybody see that? The writer of Hebrews is talking to a Jewish community, and what's important is that this Jewish community is not engaging in old temple worship in the way that it used to, even though the temple is still standing. So this gives us a clue that this is one of the older books of the New Testament, like Paul's letters. The temple still seems to be in operation, and the writer is saying, look, we don't need to eat of those ceremonial foods in the way that we do. And then in verse 10, he says, we have an altar from which those who minister at the tabernacle have no right to eat. The altar is, of course, Christ. He's saying that we take our food from the altar of Jesus Christ, and the people who are still ministering at this old temple, they don't eat of that altar. So a very, very big and important shift is occurring in the letter to the Hebrews. Now today we're going to talk about the third group, sacrifices of atonement. Again, sacrifice does three things. It establishes a relationship, it maintains the relationship, and it repairs it. Within Protestant circles, we are generally focused on this issue. So let's take a look at it. These sacrifices provide atonement. So somebody's done something they should not have done. There are points in a relationship where the relationship needs to be fixed or repaired. Everybody who has a relationship knows that. And the way it happens is through the shedding of blood. The life of the creature is signified by the blood. Very important verse is Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. And I say signified by the blood. So the blood, when man sins, he separates himself from God. God is the source of life. Man separates himself, therefore, from life. He has incurred a life debt. That life debt has to be paid. If you're going to pay a life debt, you've got to pay it with life. So the blood signifies the life of the creature, which will pay for the life of the wrongdoer. This is used, therefore, the typical word is ransom. That's an old word. There might be other words we could use, but to ransom the life of the sinner. But it also purifies the sanctuary of defilement. We mentioned yesterday, back in the time of Abraham, there was no sanctuary, there was no nation of Israel, so if Abraham messed up, all he has to worry about is his personal relationship with God. Now, however, there's this sanctuary which makes things a little more complicated. Every individual's sin is not only a personal matter between them and God, it affects the whole community because it defiles God's dwelling place. And if God's dwelling place is allowed to be defiled, then He will have to leave. And that will affect everybody. And that will happen at the end of the Old Testament. So now as you're reading through the Bible, the culminating point of the Old Testament is in the book of Ezekiel when God leaves the sanctuary. That is just a terrible, terrible thing. There's nothing worse that could happen to the nation of Israel than that she should become so immersed in sin that God would have to leave. And at that point, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians roll over the nation of Israel, and the prophets of Israel have to decide, what are we going to do? The question is, why did God elect us to be His people if He just is going to wipe us out? There must be something that He intends. And the prophets will say, no, we sinned, God punished us, but He's going to redeem us. He's going to bring us back. And one day He will return to His temple, He will restore His people, and all of that is looking forward to the New Testament. So, and when He does that, it's going to be different than it was in the old days, because He will also bring in the Gentiles. When He returns to His temple, He won't only restore Israel, but He will bring in the Gentiles. And that sets us up for the ministry of Jesus. Okay, so there's two things. There's a private thing. I've got to take care of my own sin. And then there's a more public thing. This sanctuary has to be washed of the sin that has been created. There are 3 sacrifices that we're going to deal with today. The olah, these are the Hebrew words, the chatat, and the asham. The mincha, I'll deal with very briefly here, is usually translated grain offering. So many of you have grain offerings. That's usually the translation in your book of Leviticus, the grain offering. The grain offering has no special function of its own. It is used as a substitute for the poor who cannot afford to bring an animal. Again, coined money won't be invented until the time of good old King Midas, and everybody knows that he loved gold. But when the Bible wants to say somebody's rich, you read the book of Job, when it wants to say Job's rich, it says that he has a lot of what? He's got a lot of cows. He's got a lot of animals. So to be rich is to have many, many flocks. There are poor people in Israel who cannot afford animals. So what do? They will bring a grain offering. If you read Leviticus closely, there's very many different types of grain offering. You should cook it, and you should put frankincense on it. You should bring it to the altar. If you cannot afford frankincense, you cook it and you bring it to the altar. If you're so poor that you cannot bake it on a griddle or put it in an oven, the minimal offering in the law of Moses is a handful of uncooked grain. So if that's all you can do is one handful of grain, boom, you're good. Now that's interesting because it indicates that the blood is a symbol of life. In other words, if the blood was what did the trick, or the blood of the animal, then this grain offering would not be acceptable. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. The fact that grain offerings are acceptable means that the more important issue is the heart of the person bringing the offering, because the grain offering is allowed to substitute for it. Now, Christians have in their back pocket the crucifixion of Jesus. One of the questions that always is raised is, how does all of this pertain to Jesus' sacrifice? And as a general rule, I'll say this, and you may have other questions, but through this system, the people of Israel are participating in the sacrifice of Christ. They may not know that that is what they are doing, but that is what they are doing. Does that make sense? Okay. The important thing is that they understand that their life is forfeit and that sacrifice is important and that they participate in this system. The book of Hebrews will call this system shadows. I think that's the language that the book of Hebrews uses, that these are shadows, but that Christ is the reality. And so that is the idea. Now that covers kind of this area, and I'm going to go through these 3 offerings which are dealt with in the book of Leviticus, but before I do, are there any questions up to this point? Give just a moment and see if there's any questions. Between today and tomorrow, I've just got you today, and then I've got you tomorrow, and then I'm back to the mainland. So I will take questions pertaining to this material or anything else that you're curious about, because then I'm gone. Yes?
Do the priests make their own personal sacrifices apart from sacrifices done on behalf of all the other people?
That is correct. That comes up in Hebrews. So to repeat the question, the priests are not perfect. So they too must bring sacrifices on their own behalf, in addition to the ones they bring on behalf of the Israelites. Particularly in Yom Kippur, even the high priest has to confess his sins and bring sacrifice on his own behalf. That's important to the writer of Hebrews, because the writer of Hebrews, again, will say that Jesus is not only greater than Moses, but he's greater than the old priests, because he alone did not offer a sacrifice on his own behalf. Incidentally, when Jesus enters the waters of baptism is usually for repentance, yes?
Yeah.
Why then, the first question John asks Jesus then is, why are you getting baptized? Because obviously, if Jesus is the one, then he doesn't have any sins that need to be atoned for. So why does Jesus get baptized? Everybody remember when I was talking yesterday about purifying people who are lepers? Did you read the kind of strange story about how they took the leper out into the wilderness and they had a bowl filled with water and 2 birds? How many know that ritual? You read it. A few head nods and some hand raised. Okay. Well, there's 2 birds. One bird is killed over the fresh water, and then the other bird is left alive. So the idea behind Jesus' baptism is simply this. We go into the waters of baptism to wash our sin away. Jesus goes into the water of baptism to take our sin up. So there need to be 2 people. One of them goes under the water in order to die and to wash their sin away. The other goes into the water in order to die and to take the sin up. So Jesus' baptism has precedent in the Torah that there's 2 birds that are needed. One that dies and one that's set free. They both have a role to play, but Jesus isn't baptized in order to take away his sin. He's baptized in order to take the sin up that has been washed away from the people who enter into the water with him. I think that's relevant to your question. But at any rate, the priests have their own sacrifices. Yes?
Is this the same cup in Numbers 19 as well, when it says that a man who is clean shall gather the uppy ashes and take it outside the camp?
Yes. In ritual, there is washing and there is disposal. We'll see that in Yom Kippur, but if you're thinking in terms of rituals, just think of it on analogy to ordinary human life. If I wash something with a rag, I still have to get rid of the rag. Okay? So when you're done washing with something, you're not done with your job. You've got to get rid of the thing that you wiped up. Okay? So in temple worship, there is this idea that there's 2 parts. One is the washing. The soap absorbs all of the impurity, but then we wash it down the drain. That's what soap does. I used soap this morning, and it kind of absorbed everything. It's a wonderful tool, but then I put it down the drain. So in the same way, there is washing. What is washed is transferred to the soap, and then the soap is disposed of and washed down. And maybe that's a useful analogy for understanding how this works. Since we're talking of transformation, before I go into these 3 sacrifices, when you look at this tabernacle, always when we're reading Exodus, we say, what does this have to do with me? But I always, when you read about this tabernacle, this is you. This is me. We were created to be temples in which God's Spirit dwells. When you are reading about the tabernacle, you're not just reading about something that happened a long time ago that has nothing to do with you. This is a map of your soul. Everything that went on in this tabernacle is going to go on inside of you, is going to go on inside of me. It's very, very relevant. There's a lot to be learned. You go back to the book of Exodus and read that tabernacle story very closely, okay? Because it's relevant. It's about me, and it's about you, and it's about Christ. So, the first of the three offerings is called olah in Hebrew. The Hebrew word olah is from a verb that just means going up. So it could be called the going up offering. And it refers to the fact that it's burnt on the altar and the smoke goes up. It's usually translated in English burnt offering. The Greek word here is holocaust, which means holy burnt. That word gets borrowed to refer to things that happened in World War II. Jews do not refer to the event in World War II as Holocaust for that reason. They'll call it the Shoah. I went to a Jewish university where I got my graduate work done, and you don't say the word Holocaust. You don't, because it's a mixing of a terrible event and a religious sacrifice, and so they'll use the word Shoah, which means destruction. Shoah is a Hebrew word that means destruction. So if you have any Jewish friends and we want to talk about the Holocaust, just use the word Shoah. Holocaust is a little bit offensive if you're Jewish. So, most ancient atoning this is the most ancient atoning sacrifice. So whenever we read about Abraham doing a sacrifice, or Noah doing a sacrifice, or Abraham's father-in-law Jethro doing a sacrifice, it's always an olah. These other two don't appear until the sanctuary is built, and that's a clue as to what they do. So, this predates the building of the sanctuary. I'm going to underline everything here, so it doesn't mean anything after a while, does it? But it's exclusively concerned with ransoming the life of the sinner. So that's the most familiar idea to all of us, is that sacrifice pays for our sin and the life of the animal substitutes for our life. And so this is the sacrifice most of us know the most about. And so that includes inner conditions of the heart to things that we have done, and if we like the Anglican liturgy, to things that we have left undone. We use that sometimes in my church. We confess in thought, word, and deed for the things that we have done, for the things that we have left undone. And the blood is then dashed against the sides of the altar. So if you were performing a sacrifice, just to walk you through there's 7 rituals or rites that will occur. The first is as I present the animal. So I'm Chad Lewis. I bring my animal. That's my first rite. I will bring it to the east of the altar if it is a holy sacrifice. I will bring it north of the altar if it's a most holy sacrifice. So the holiness of the sacrifice determines how close I can get to God's presence. If it's a most holy sacrifice, I'll go north of the altar, closer. If it's a holy sacrifice, I'll go east of the altar, a little further away. Second, I put my hand on the head of the animal. That is usually a symbol that I'm owning this animal and I haven't brought my neighbors. So, kind of like in any formal legal proceeding, we need to formally state, like if you go to a law court, you put your hand on the Bible, and they ask, it's assumed in ordinary conversation that you're not lying to people. But in a law court, they want a formal declaration. That way, if you're caught, they can prosecute you later. You put your left hand on the Bible and say, is what you're about to say true? You say, yes. In the same way, the second rite I put my hand on the head of the animal and I say, this is my animal. Third, I have to cut the throat of my own animal. The priests don't do it for you. So if you don't like the sight of blood, send someone else to do it on your behalf. But I take a dagger and I will slit the throat of the animal, and that will kill it. At that point, the priests take over. They'll usually hold a bowl under the throat of the animal. Most of us are from urban environments, so we don't know a whole lot about this. But if you cut the throat, there's going to be a quick, heavy gush of blood. At that point, the priest will catch that in a bowl, and then they will take the blood in the bowl, and they will do one of several things with it. Now, if this is not a sacrifice of atonement, but just for meat, they're just going to pour the blood out on the ground. And there's several verses in the Bible that specify that. Just pour the blood out on the ground. However, if it's an olah, they're going to dash the blood against the side of the altar. That sends the life back up to God. All right? Boom, shoo! So, the flesh returns to the ground it came from. The soul or the spirit or the life returns to God who gave it. Yeah.
So, would the father of the household
Mm-hmm.
offer up sacrifices for his children? If they were really young, like 5 years old or something like that, the kids wouldn't have to do it themselves, would they?
That's right. You get a little bit of that in Job. So you've read the book of Job. Job is a very righteous man. He's also very rich. So yes, you can be rich and good at the same time. It's okay. But his children don't, he does it on behalf of his children. So a good question, we often wonder, well, how did this work in actual practice? When you read books like Job or Samuel, there's clues. Job's able to present sacrifices on behalf of his family, which he does. Very, very good question. And Job, he doesn't even know that his kids have done anything wrong. He's just worried that they might have. And so he brings sacrifices anyways in case they have sinned against God in their heart. So Job is a regular sacrificer. So the blood is caught in the bowl. It is dashed against the side of the altar, and the altar is communicating between God and the sacrificer. It signifies that the life has been returned to God. You have just paid God a life for a life. Okay, what about the body of the animal? That is then placed on top of the altar. At this point, the priests will take over the animal and they will butcher it there at the altar. There's probably several officiating. To butcher an animal is actually physically laborious. I've seen it and I wouldn't want to have to do it myself. It's a lot of work. But they're going to quarter the animal in pieces. If it is a sacrifice for communion, then they would distribute the flesh. Some would go on the altar. The priests would get some. Some would go to the person bringing the animal. In this case, the whole animal goes on the altar except for the hide. The priests get to keep the hide, and then it's burnt up on the altar. And then you will dispose of the remains. This of all of the sacrifices of atonement is voluntary. That's important. And so it's concerned with private sins that do not impact the sanctuary. The fact that it's voluntary indicates that this is for private sin, because nobody can make you bring an offering for something that's private, right? I caught you. So this is entirely between the offerer and God. And so this is very, very private. The next two offerings, the Chatat and the Asham, are for public sins, and so they're mandatory. To say that the offering has to be brought means that the individual has done something that the whole community is aware of. They've done something that impacts everybody, and therefore you can require them to bring it. And because it's public, these concern the maintenance of the sanctuary. So I'm going to go on to those in just a minute, but any questions about the Olah?
And you were going through the 7 rites of sacrifice. Can you reiterate over?
Yeah, I mentioned there were 7, and then I kind of left off count. So let me make sure I got them. Number 1, here we go. Present the animal. And that will be either east or north of the altar, depending on how holy it is. Number 2, put your hand on the head of the animal, claim ownership for it. Number 3, cut the animal's throat. Number 4, this is where the priests take over. They will handle the blood. They will do one of several things with it, depending on what kind of sacrifice it is. But the 4th rite is that the priests will catch the blood in a bowl, and they will do one of 3 things. They'll either pour it out on the ground, dash it against the altar, or they'll wipe it on one or another part of the sanctuary. 5th rite, the priests will butcher the body. So they'll take the body of the animal and they'll butcher it. 6, they will distribute the body after they've butchered it. Either the whole animal will go on the altar, or the body of the animal will be distributed between the priest, the altar, and the person bringing it. And that again depends on the kind of sacrifice that it is. And then 7th, they must dispose of the remains. So some of the disposal will mean either the whole thing goes up in the altar, or some of it is eaten, if it's a sacrifice that's eaten. And then the ashes that are on the altar, or the guts, those will be disposed of. So the 7th rite is to dispose.
Is the priest only involved in step 4? Is
Uh,
the priest only involved in step 4?
That's right. So steps 1 through 3 are done by the person bringing the animal, and steps 4 through 7 are done by the priests. So that's a good question. There's a division of labor. If I'm bringing the animal, I do 1 through 3. The priests do 4 through 7. Yes. Other question? Yes, in the back.
Was each animal specific to like one sin? Could like one animal represent sins?
Good question. The Bible doesn't answer that question. However, the question is, do I bring one animal per sin? The Bible doesn't answer that question, though the Jews answered it as we might well have, which is, if I brought one animal for sin, I'm going to go bankrupt in a week. Right? So the tradition then, we have these sacred festivals in which you're required to go to the sanctuary. And so the tradition within ancient Israel is then on the festal occasions, when you go to the sanctuary, you will bring an offering to pay for the sins since the last time you came to the sanctuary. Does that make sense? So when you get to the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, you'll read that Samuel's father, Elkanah, he would make his regular pilgrimage to the temple, and when he did that, he would bring offerings, and those would cover all of his past sins. Now, what if you left one out? Or what if you've got some rabble in the Israelite community who are up to no good, who don't bring any offerings? Those will be dealt with on Yom Kippur, when the high priests offer sacrifice for the whole year, for himself, for the whole Israelite community, is sort of like to make up the difference. So whatever people have failed to do in their own right, the high priest will take care of. Now, the main issue here is the high priest and the priesthood kind of cover everybody's butts, as it were. But what if the priesthood becomes corrupt? Right? If the priesthood becomes corrupt, you're in a lot of trouble. And that will happen in the history of Israel. The priesthood will become corrupt, and at that point, Jesus will enter into... One of the things Jesus does is he condemns the priesthood, right? He comes to the temple. When Jesus in the New Testament comes to the temple and calls it his house, that's like serious. The priests naturally, when Jesus comes and says, my house, think, who does this guy think he is, right? This house belongs to God. It doesn't belong to this guy from Nazareth. But Jesus talks about the temple as though he owns it. And in a way, he's fulfilling the words of the prophets, because the prophet says when God returns to his house, he will cleanse it. He will cleanse it. He will make it whole again, and he will enact judgment. And that's what Jesus is doing in that particular. No other Israelite has a right to enter into this place and turn over the tables and throw up a ruckus. Nobody has the right to do that. But Jesus acts as though he does. And so it's up to the Israelites to decide, okay, is this guy an imposter? Or is he who he says he is? That's a big question that the Jews will have to address. Very good question. Yeah.
You may have already answered this, but if the priests can only be a sacrifice, what if people don't sacrifice for a few minutes?
Yes.
They sacrifice daily? Like, how do the priests eat if no one's going to sacrifice?
If the Israelite community is unfaithful, the priesthood suffers. In fact, when you get to the book of Malachi, the priests are working on Sabbath day in their fields to stay alive. And the prophet Malachi is very upset about this, because this is not what priests are supposed to be doing. The priests are not supposed to be going out and getting ordinary jobs in order to stay alive. So if the Israelite community is not faithful, then the priesthood suffers. When we get to the New Testament, it's very different. The priesthood is corrupt and very, very rich. So as you read the Bible, you'll have to kind of keep an eye on the priests. The priests can be either rich and corrupt or poor and suffering. Being a priest doesn't necessarily make you a good guy or a bad guy. It really depends on the way the nation is developing. Yes, and then yes. Yes.
Can you talk more about the community aspect of this? Because everything that you keep saying, I keep hearing the community suffers, or if the priests don't do right, the community suffers, or if the community doesn't do right, the priests suffer. Like, why do you think God put big emphasis on community?
Well, I think the question is, why does God put such an emphasis on community? If the priesthood suffers, then the community suffers. If the community suffers, the priesthood suffers. It's communal. I think the fact of the matter is we are not individuals. We are individuals in a sense of the word, but our lives are bound to each other. I was born into a particular house at a particular time and a place. Everything that my parents did right, I've benefited from. Everything that my parents screwed up on, I've suffered from. I can whine about it, but it's the truth, right? Okay. So we're all agreed that we are a human family. And so I think one of the important things about the Bible is that it dismisses a kind of myth that we have in the modern world, that we are sort of floating individuals that have no connection to the human race or to the people of God as a whole. We are not floating individuals. Everything I do impacts the life of my wife, my children, and future generations. I got to live with that. So if I mess up, everybody that is in my family suffers. I'm also a pastor. If I give bad teaching, my congregation suffers, right? Then they get bad teaching. So one of the important things to realize is that I think here the Bible is just being realistic. We as human beings impact each other, and so we stand or fall as a group. And so when Jesus does his sacrifice, it's not only for us as individuals, it's for his people Israel, it's for the whole human race, because all of us together, we affect each other. So that's a good question. That's the best answer I can give. I'm glad you asked it. I've reached a point in my life where I take it for granted so much I fail to mention it. We're one. And I can't think of myself as just as an independent person. I'm not independent. I depend upon my parents. I depend upon my wife. I depend upon my church. I depend upon God, and there are people who depend on me. So we are all mutually dependent, and anybody who, I'm independent, is either a fool or a liar. They're not independent. All of us are mutually. Actually, there's only one being in the whole universe who is independent. God. God is the only thing in the whole universe that is independent. Everything depends on him. Other question? Yes.
It's a popular belief right now in regards to there's no hierarchy in sin. God doesn't weigh what's bigger or smaller. But it seems like back then there was a level of severity within the impurity.
Good question.
So how
That
do
will
they measure the impurity back then?
That will pertain to this sin. So let me move on to the chatat. And in the process of discussing it, I think I'll answer your question. So the second sin, or the second sacrifice for atonement, is called chatat. Now here I got to pull a little... all of your translations are wrong. Not like 100%. But almost all of your translations will call this the sin offering. That is not correct. It should be translated the purification offering. The main reason why is, first of all, linguistic, but also because of the way it's used. This offering is sometimes brought for moral impurity, but it is also brought for ritual impurity. Any kind of impurity that affects the sanctuary takes one of these offerings. So for example, if my wife had a baby, if she's had 4 of them, she would have to bring one of these to the sanctuary. It would not make sense to call that a sin offering, right? Because there's no sin involved in having a child. It's a purification offering because of ritual impurity. On the other hand, there are things that I do wrong that also require these. So this offering has a much broader function than that of sin. If you call it a sin offering, you're going to get caught in some awkward situations because you'll say, well, the woman had a baby and she needs to bring a sin offering. You'll think, well, wait, what did she do wrong? She's just having a baby. So on the other hand, they are brought for sin. So I will call this a purification offering. The reason why this translational issue hasn't been fixed, in all honesty, is because most people don't care about the book of Leviticus. Oh, yeah. But you've read it and you know why. It's a hard book. Most translators and Christians have their attention directed elsewhere. But it should be translated this way. It's used, again, to wash away moral or ritual impurity, which is not connected with guilt. Very, very important. That has defiled the sanctuary. So in this case, the blood is used to wiped on the horns of the bronze altar, the gold altar, or sprinkled on the ark. The more severe the impurity, the deeper it penetrates into the sanctuary. And that addresses the question just raised. it is sometimes said that sin is sin and no sin is worse than another. I have heard that said. There's no verse in the Bible that says that. Okay, so clarification. And so sometimes that question is thrown my direction and they say, isn't it true that sin is sin and no one is worse than another? And my answer is usually, no. And the main reason is because the Bible recognizes that there are some sins or impurities that are worse. Because the worse it is, the deeper it penetrates into the sanctuary. Lesser sins penetrate here. More serious sins penetrate into the holy place. And the most serious sins of all penetrate into the most holy place. Now the question is, what makes it serious or not serious? And there's two things that the Bible mentions in Leviticus. One is intentionality. Unintentional sins penetrate the outer court and the holy place. And it says that in the book of Leviticus, if anybody sins unintentionally. However, Leviticus 16 on Yom Kippur says rebellion or intentional sin penetrates the most holy place. In other words, the degree of conscious intent is important. If I sin inadvertently, then that's not as serious. But if I sin in what the Bible in Numbers calls a high-handed way, well, that's more serious. And we all know what that kind of sin is. There are some things where I do by accident, and then the second one I'll mention, and then I'll take your question. Much of it then also depends on the person who sins. If the high priest sins, that is far more serious than if an ordinary priest sins, or if a leader sins, or if a lay person sins. So, two things affect the seriousness of the sin. Is it intentional? And not what kind of sin is it, but who does it. And that's a little bit different than our modern thinking. So in other words, if a person in my church were to have an affair, that would not be as big of a deal as if I were to have an affair. Because I'm the pastor. So if I mess up, everybody below me who's under my leadership is affected. Whereas if just an ordinary person messes up, they may affect their family or their children. But it's not as big of a deal. So the two main issues in the Bible, first answer to your question is all sin equal? The Levitical code says no. There's two things that matter. First, how much of a leader is the person who sins? And also, how intentional was it? Those are the two big issues. Yeah.
First John talks about sin not leading to death.
There's various passages in the Bible that talk about sin. I think in John, because it's connected with the Gospel of John, the sin that leads to death is probably connected with Jesus' talk about the sin of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So Jesus only refers to one sin that is not forgivable in the Gospel of John. He says all sins will be forgiven except the sin of the Holy Spirit. Now he doesn't say what that is. So we're like, oh, geez, have I committed it? Oops. And then John talks about sin that is unto death, and by that he means spiritual death. So we talked a little bit about that yesterday. I don't think the unforgivable sin or the sin unto death is anything that you could commit inadvertently. It must be something that is very conscious, very deliberate, and by logical reasoning, it is a sin of rejecting forgiveness. I mean, anything can be forgiven except rejecting forgiveness, right? Because if you say no to Christ, then you've said no to anything that could ever help you. So in that that particular case, I think the sin unto death or the sin against the Spirit speaks of Christ. All that the Holy Spirit does is speak of Christ. That's what Christ says. So the sin against the Spirit is the sin of rejecting Christ outright.
I didn't know it was
I mean, if I murder, I can be forgiven. If I commit adultery, I can be forgiven. If I steal, I can be forgiven. If I do anything, I can be forgiven. But if I reject forgiveness because I say, I am not a sinner and I do not need forgiveness, then, well, then I'm done. I mean, that's it. So, yeah.
So in Hebrews 10:26 it says, if you go on sinning deliberately after you see the knowledge of the truth, no longer remains as
Yes. Chapter, verse again. I want to read it out loud so everybody can hear.
Hebrews 10:26.
10:26? Okay, so relevant to your question, and since part of the class is Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, we want to read Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26, which is a favorite passage that Calvinists and Arminians argue about forever. If we keep on sinning, and this again is chapter 10, verse 26. If we, and here's an important word, deliberately. And so that is a language that appears in the book of Leviticus. If we deliberately keep on sinning after we have received the knowledge of truth, there is no sacrifice for sins left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment and raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. Everything in this passage depends on the force we give to the word deliberately, okay? Because most of us, when we sin, do so consciously. In other words, we know what we're doing. I mean, when I do something that I shouldn't do, a good deal of the time I'm pretty well aware that I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. And so the force of this passage, I think, okay, and so let me say, before I answer your question, we're now entering into the realm of speculation. Okay? I'm not Moses coming down with the tablets. I'm Chad Lewis giving you an opinion about how to interpret this. You should test what I'm about to say against the testimony of Scripture, because I am not about to speak with authority. I'm about to speak what I think. Everybody with me? Okay. All right. What I think is going on in this passage is he's saying sinning deliberately after we've received the knowledge of truth. In other words, once we've been exposed to the gospel, we've heard the gospel story, and in spite of hearing the gospel story, we reject it and continue in our old way of life. There is no forgiveness left for us. So I don't think this passage is about people who've converted to Christianity but continue to struggle with sin. Because that's true of everybody. Everybody who converts to Christianity still struggles with sin. I think this passage is about those who have heard the gospel and do not convert and continue in their life of sin. Okay? Or, he goes a little further from that. Let's see. Let me read the whole passage. Anybody who rejected the law of Moses died without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So you see in verse 28, he immediately follows up that verse with anybody who rejected the law of Moses. He's talking about people, not people who accepted the law of Moses, but then struggled to keep it, but people who rejected it. How much morally do you think severely do man deserves to be punished? Who has trampled the Son of God underfoot? Who has trampled, blah, 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 blah. On and on he goes. So I think in context, I think a strong argument can be made that what we're dealing with here is not people who have accepted the gospel and continue to struggle with sin, but people who have heard the gospel and knowing that grace has been offered them and that they are convicted as a sinner, continue to live in their old life. Yeah.
What if you've accepted the grace and, let's say, the term backslide?
Yeah.
For like a period of time, you converted, but then you blatantly knowing you turn away from it. But then like you turn away from it. How does that?
Well, again, the question is, if you turn away from, everybody struggles with sin. So the question, I guess, for me is, if you continue to come in prayer to God, confessing your sin and asking Him for forgiveness, then you have not rejected Christ. You have not rejected Christ. Now, God will judge about whether you are sincere in that. And God knows the heart. So in other words, it doesn't mean that I can just sort of mouth, God, I'm sorry, and not mean it. But between you and God, you know whether you mean what you say. But if you continue to confess your sins and you continue to come to Christ, then in no meaningful sense have you rejected Him. I mean, you may not be the poster boy for Christianity. I mean, right? I mean, but it's an issue of you're not damned. I don't think that you're damned because you still realize that you are a sinner. You still realize that you depend upon Christ for grace. Now, again, we're talking about an issue that has divided Christians over the centuries. So again, I'll remind you, I'm not speaking on authority. I'm speaking how I read this passage from Hebrews and how I understand the verse that you mentioned. There are different levels of spiritual growth and attainment. So I don't think that that is a life that any of us would want to live. I mean, I want to live a life in which I overcome sin, in which I overcome the power of sin, and I see the presence of God in my life, and I put old things behind me, and I move on. But on the other hand, I'm also a pastor, and I often have people who come to me and say, hey, you know, I can't get over this hill. And as a general rule, I don't intimidate them with threats of damnation. I don't say, well, you're in big trouble. I generally say, you need to keep depending on God. I know you feel pressed and weighed and buried under this thing. But God has the ability to bring you out from under it, and He has protected you. You know, Paul says, and I should probably close with this before I break, and then I'll move on. If when we were sinners, Christ died for us. In other words, if while we had no knowledge of Christ and we are enemies of God, Jesus still died for us, then how much more, once we know God and have given our trust to Him, will He save us? Right? If Jesus died for us when we knew nothing about Him and when we were lost in our sins, then how can we ever doubt that He will bring us through now having come to know Him and put our trust in Him? Right? So I believe that. I believe that. Okay. Now, I want to hit these other sacrifices, and we should be able to finish this today, but it's time for the break, and you may have an announcement.